Hi besties, welcome to today's video. We are going to be combining my wrap up for March and my TBR for April. I decided I wanted to do the video with both in one just because I skipped doing the TBR jar this month. I already was very confident in the 4 books that I knew I wanted to read and figured it was pointless to even do the TBR jar if I'm not going to read those, because I have had my eye on these 4 books the past couple weeks and know that I really want to get to them this month. I'm going to quick go over first what I read in March, what I thought of them and rated them, and then I'm going to tell you guys what I plan and hope to read this month in April. I use Bookmori. I don't know if a lot of people use this or not. My friend recommended it to me. She uses it as well, and I really liked the layout of it and what all you could do on Bookmori. I highly recommend it if you don't already use it. I heavily use Goodreads and Bookmori the most to keep track of what I'm reading, where I'm at in the book, and what my thoughts are on said book. I really like Bookmori specifically because at the end of each month there's a calendar that has like your final layout of all the books that you read in that month and what you rated them. And I really like being able to see that, like what I read and what day I finished it on and what I rated it, and having it all laid out on the calendar. So I have all of that right here. The first book that I read in March is Caraval, and this my book club read together. It was a lot of fun getting to go back into this world, even though I'm not too familiar with the Caraval world per se, but I am familiar with a couple of the characters from this trilogy, because if you haven't seen any of my other videos, I did read the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy before starting this. If you haven't heard of this series before, or the Once Upon a Broken Heart series, they are interconnected. The Caraval trilogy comes first, and then you're supposed to read the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy. And I knew going in to reading the Once Upon a Broken Heart series that there were certain points in the plot of the Caraval trilogy that were going to be spoiled for me by reading the Once Upon a Broken Heart series first. But I also heard from a few people that it's not something that they were too worried about, and that didn't end up being as big of a deal or something that bothered them as much. And so I decided to like start out with reading the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy and then go into this, because I also heard that the Caraval trilogy people didn't like as much as they liked the Once Upon a Broken Heart series. So I read all 3 books, absolutely loved them, totally agree with what everyone was saying and the hype around that series because it was so good. It gives off these magical vibes, but it also was like a twist on a traditional romance, because the main male character, in the beginning at least for me, he wasn't someone that I was sure I liked or not, but it wasn't until the 2nd book that I started to really like fall in love with him and rooting for them to be a couple. I ended up really loving that series, but now that I have finished that trilogy, I wanted to go back and read the Caraval trilogy because the main guy character is in the final book of this trilogy. I wanted to get more of him. So I finished Caraval this month, and I rated this one a 3.5 stars. I rated it a 3.5, but I was leaning more toward a 4. So it's honestly about, like, if you're really gonna get picky, it's 3.75. I thought it was incredible. I absolutely loved this book. I thought it was so good and I was eating it up. I annotated a good chunk of the book as well and really loved the characters and everything, but it did confuse me a lot. There was definitely a lot that just like, it's one of those books where you can't really tell what's true and real from what's fake, and that lost me at times. Like, it honestly felt like a fever dream, and I've heard someone explain that before and I totally agree with them. So I think that's why it brought it down a little bit, but also at the same time, like, I enjoyed that too. It's kind of confusing, but this is covering 2 sisters, Donatella and Scarlett. They are extremely close with each other, but they have a horrible dad who treats them horribly, like does these unfathomable things that it's not okay. And they are trying to get off that island. They've lived on this island and lived under their dad's control, and ever since the mom died, the dad has just treated his daughters horribly. So the daughters are trying to escape and get off the island now that they're old enough, but he makes it practically impossible for them to escape. One way that they are trying to escape, or at least the one way that Scarlett wants to escape, is by joining the Caraval games. And for the vibes of this book, it really gives off magical realism mixed with carnival games and Hunger Games. With the Caraval games, you can only be invited to play the game by Legend, the Caraval master himself. If you get sent an invite, you get to be a part of the games, or you can choose to be someone who watches the games. For those that decide to play in the games, only one person can win, and they don't necessarily, like the other people who don't win, don't necessarily die or anything. So that's where the Hunger Games vibes stop, because it's not like killing each other until one person wins, but like high stakes and only one person can win. It's very deceiving, it's very confusing. It messes with your mind, but it's also so good. It kind of gives Alice in Wonderland vibes with that, because you're not sure like what's real from what's fake, like I said, and it's just very interesting. So I really do recommend this series. I think that it's good so far, and I've only read the first book, but I did read the other three, the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy, and absolutely loved those. So I'm enjoying going back now and reading this series more, knowing what's to come. If you decide to read Caraval trilogy first and you want to read it in order, that's perfectly fine, and you might end up liking this trilogy, but it is a bit slower so far for the vibes than the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy was. So if you finish this trilogy or you're starting it and you're not really sure about how you feel about it, definitely at least give the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy a try, because that series was so good, and a lot of people end up liking or tend to like that series more than this one. Then next, I read The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. Finally read it, and it was so good. I rated this book a 5 stars, hands down. This is a 6-star read of mine, and I don't give 6 stars to too many reads throughout the year. I usually only have 2 or 3. It's the books that truly stood out from every other book that I've read, and just like hold such a special place in my heart. So The 7-Year Slip is definitely one of those. And if you haven't heard of The 7-Year Slip before, or at least don't know what it's about, the main female character, her name is Clementine West, and I don't want to give too much away or anything, but this book had me smiling, it had me giggling, kicking my feet, laughing, crying. Like, it was such a good book, and it pulled at my heartstrings. Like, I could not put this book down. I annotated so much of it, and I ate it up. Like, I did not want it to end. I cannot recommend it enough. It's a very simple romance, but at the same time, like, it has a fun twist to it. It does have a little bit of magical realism to it. The main character, Clem, at the very beginning of the book, you start the book finding out that her aunt passed away, and her aunt passed down her condo to Clem. So Clem has her aunt's condo in New York, and she finally decides to move in. She had a really hard time with losing her aunt. She was extremely close to her aunt. They used to go on trips and travel all the time together, so it was really difficult for Clem to move into her aunt's condo, and she pushed it off for a while. When Clem moves in, one thing that she knows going into it, her aunt told her when she was little that the apartment is magical. She said that it can bring you back 7 years in the past. When she moves into the apartment, she realizes that it's real. When she goes into the apartment in the very beginning of the book and realizes that she's 7 years in the past, she is not alone in the apartment, and there's a guy that's there. It just is it's just such a good book. It was very interesting, very well done, and it played the role of magical realism very well. Like, it covered that trope, that genre very well. I felt like it wasn't overdone. It wasn't super like cliche. There was a lot of like realism still to it, and it was a good balance of everything, and I can't recommend it enough. And lastly, last but certainly not least, I read Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas, and I'm so excited that I finally have started this series. I finished this book actually at the very beginning of April, so technically I didn't finish it in March, but it was only a few days into April, so I'm counting it. But it was such a great way to end March, and I annotated the crap out of this book. Like, I went hard on this book because I wanted to be able to remember so many things, be able to go back in this book later on when I'm farther in the series, in case there's anything that I want to look back on from this book. Because if you don't already know, I would be surprised if you didn't, the Throne of Glass series is an 8-book series. So when you're in the last few books, in case there's anything that was super important in this book that I want to go back to and read over, I can, because I've marked it all down. And if you're curious about like how I did my annotating, what parts I decided to tab and everything like that, let me know in the comments below. I can always do like a separate video covering that. But I rated this book a 4 stars. I absolutely loved it. I thought it was so good I ate it up. And I know that usually with a fantasy series, starting out, the very first book is usually going to be slower, and a lot of people don't enjoy that book as much because it's a lot of world building, character building. But this book had mystery to it. It had very likable characters, and just like the plot of it was so interesting to me that I couldn't get enough of it. Like I couldn't put it down. It was so incredibly written. And that being said, like it was incredibly written, especially for the age Sarah J. Maas was when she wrote this book. I think she was 16, or don't quote me on it. She was definitely young when she wrote this book and started out this series, because this one was written in, I think it was 2013 or 2012. Yeah, it was written in 2012, or at least published. It was published in 2012. And the fact that she was able to come up with these characters and this storyline and all of this and make this up in her head blows my mind. She's just an incredible author. We all already knew that. Sarah J. Maas, the queen herself, she gets so much hype, and it's for a very good reason. And I was so excited to finally start this series. I'm starting it with 2 other friends. We're trying to read through it together with each other and pace ourselves with reading around 1 book a month. But a little description of what this book is about. This book covers main character Selena. She was trained from a younger age to be an assassin. She was trained heavily to be an assassin, and she's known now in the present, or at least in the present time of this book. Her name is known by many, and she was a really good assassin, but she was captured and forced into working in the mines of the town that she lives in, and she was treated horribly. Then someone comes and invites her to escape that hell of a life that she's living and compete to be the king's assassin of this town that you come to know more about. It's a competition between her and multiple other champions who are fighting to be the assassin for the king. They are definitely well known for something that they are good at, whether they are a mass murderer or an assassin like her, or a thief, or just known for some type of crime that they do, which is wild. Starting out a book, you wouldn't think like, oh, I'm gonna root for this character like the whole time. She's an assassin. Like, no, I'm not gonna do that. But something different about Selena is that she didn't enjoy killing the people that she killed. She didn't know any better. She lost her parents when she was young, and she was trained to be an assassin, and so it's all she grows up knowing. So that's like the general idea, you know, like going into it, and in the beginning few chapters that you learn about Selena. It's a wild book. There's so much that happens, and like I said, there's mystery involved in the book, and there's like people dying in the castle, and you don't know how they're dying, but you know that they're brutally murdered, and you don't know who is murdering these people. It's really interesting, and there's just like, there's so much to the book, and I thought it was so well done. So those are the books that I read in March, and it was an incredible month. Like, really good reading month. I was so happy with the way that that month turned out. Now going into the books that I am really excited and hopeful to read for April, I'm gonna quickly go through them and give a super brief description of them. So the first book that I actually already started is Crown of Midnight. This is the next book in the Throne of Glass series. And one thing that a lot of people know, or if you don't know, there is multiple different options for the order to read this series in. So I'm gonna put up a picture of the entire series. And this is the chronological order of the books. There is technically a prequel, The Assassin's Blade, and then the rest of the 7 books in the series. However, people decide it's kind of like the same idea as Marvel, where some people read the series in chronological order and they swear by that and think that everyone should read it in chronological order, and other people read it in this other order, which they say is a more emotional way to read the series. And knowing myself, I'm an emotional reader. I get attached to the characters, and so I was intrigued with the more emotional way than the chronological way. So I decided that I'm gonna read it in this order. I decided that I wanted to read it with The the Assassin's Blade being third because it's so confusing. Some people read the Assassin's Blade third and some people read the Assassin's Blade fourth in the series. Super confusing, and I was like, I don't know when I'm supposed to read it. So I talked to many people and I got different opinions, and they recommended I read Throne of Glass first and read the Assassin's Blade later. And then I decided on my own that I wanted to read the Assassin's Blade third instead of fourth because that's the way that Sarah J. Maas recommended you read it in that order. And I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna follow her order because she literally wrote these books. So there's a reason she's recommending it in this order. But I'll leave it there and I'm gonna get back to talking about Crown of Midnight because I don't want to confuse people too much, but just a basic description of what it is. It just continues from where the story left off in Throne of Glass with Selena and some of the main characters that you learn of and get to know in Throne of Glass. I have to keep it vague because I don't want to give any spoilers away, but that is essentially what this book is about, and I am so excited and eager to continue this book and the series and everything. I absolutely love it. Can't stop thinking about the series and can't wait to learn more about this whole world. So that is the first book that I am reading in April. The next book I am reading in April, or hoping to read in April, is Legendary. So the next book in the Caraval trilogy. I am reading this with my book club. Again, we are continuing with the series together, and Legendary is the second book. And again, I'm not going to be able to describe much of this book because it is a continuation of where Caraval left off, and so I don't want to give any spoilers away, but it does focus on the same main characters and continuing the story from where it left off at this wild ending of Caraval. And I'm really eager to get back into this world as well and to see what happens and continue this story. The third book I am excited or hoping to read is One Dark Window. I'm really eager to finally get into this duology. It's One Dark Window and Two Twisted Crowns is the second book, and I believe it's just staying a duology. At least at the moment it's considered a duology, so I'm really eager to get into this series and start reading this book because I've heard incredible things about this duology, and one of my best friends read it and absolutely was obsessed with it. So another book club that I'm in, separate of the one that I mentioned earlier, we are all reading One Dark Window together. So that is my next hopeful. I honestly don't know anything about the series other than people really loved it, highly recommended it, rated it highly, and my best friend was obsessed with it and said, you need to read these books ASAP. So I said, yes ma'am, and added it to my TBR. So I'm really hoping that I can get to it this month and really eager to finally read it. And lastly, I have the fine print on my hopefuls for April. I've had this book, I know, before you all go saying anything in the comments, I know I've had the fine print on my TBR the last couple months, and it should say that, like, it should say something that, like, it is a really good book that I keep putting it on my list. Like, it's so highly talked of. Everyone like enjoys it and rates it pretty highly, like I think like 4 or 5 stars usually. I've been wanting to read it for so long, but I keep getting stuck in these fantasy series that it just like, I read slowly, and I read them much slower than I read other books, because when it's a fantasy world, like I read twice as slow because I really want to soak up the world, the characters, really like picture myself in the world and in the character's shoes. And I also annotate fantasy books because there's so much to them that you would get confused and lost if you didn't annotate it or like write down notes. And so I usually take my time with fantasy books. I usually read slower just because it takes me longer to understand the new characters, the new world, and everything like that. So I didn't get to the fine print in March. Again, I didn't get to it in February either, but I am really, really hoping that I can get to it this month. I think I'm probably going to read it after Crown of Midnight. I don't want to read too many fantasy books in a row that are different worlds and confuse myself. So I'll probably take a break, read the fine print, and then go into one of the other 2 books. But this is part of the Dreamland Billionaires series, and if you haven't heard of it before, it follows a group of brothers. Each book in the trilogy is following a different brother. A lot of people have said that it gives Disney World, Disneyland vibes, and if you know me, you know that I love Disney, obviously, And so I've been really wanting to read this book and see what I think of it because a lot of people thought that it was really good and said really good things about it. I'm really eager to get to it, and I think I'm going to, like I said, read it right after reading Crown of Midnight just to give myself a break and read a normal, fun romance and see what this book is finally all about. So that is the end of this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you made it this far, that was a lot of talking, I know, but just a quick recap over what I read in March and what I plan to read in April. First, I read Caraval by Stephanie Garber, and I rated this book a 3.75 stars. Then I read The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston, and I rated this one a 5 stars. Then I read Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas, and I rated this one a 4 stars. And in April, I'm really hoping to be able to read The Fine Print by Lauren Asher, One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig, Legendary by Stephanie Garber, continuing the series, and last but certainly not least, Crown of Midnight by Sarah J. Maas. I'm really excited for this month, and I was so happy with the way that March turned out and really hoping that that continues. I was in quite a bit of a major book slump at the beginning of this year, and I'm really excited that I'm finally out of it and have been having a lot of good reads lately, and I hope that continues for a while because being in a book slump sucks. So fingers crossed that it is another good month like March was, and let me know in the comments below if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them. Make sure that it is spoiler-free comments, or leave a warning at the beginning of the comment if you do put spoilers in there so that it doesn't ruin it for others. Like this video, make sure to subscribe to my channel, hit the notification bell so that you don't miss another video, and I will see you guys soon with my next video. Bye! Didn't want to be the book editor for. He denied Nora when she asked him to be the book editor for her author's book.